807 92.1 WROI. And on a Monday morning, it is now time for Doc Talk. And we have as our guest in the studios, Dr. Keith Thomae. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Hey, good morning. Great to be here.
Little foggy out there, but otherwise it's not too bad. This would be October, which means it's, it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month.
Yes, sir.
Is it also Women's Health Awareness Month or something like that?
Combination, yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Well, tell us what we got on the agenda for this.
Well, today I'm going to spend the time talking about Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And there's a lot of things to talk about, and I think you'll enjoy the half an hour that we spend talking about that. In particular, I'm going to talk about the history of breast cancer, give you some data about breast cancer, the pathophysiology, some things about screening, some things about the surgical side, the diagnosis, a little about RT, which is a radiation treatment, a little about chemotherapy. So I'm going to hit all the aspects and hopefully give the viewers and listeners a little insight more on breast cancer.
Okay. Very good.
All right. So I'm going to start out by talking about the history of breast cancer. Breast cancer has been around since ancient times, and there were pictures on rocks and things of women with that disease, and not a lot really progressed as far as treatment. The next thing we really heard was Hippocrates. We've all heard that name in the past, and he's the first one to really describe breast cancer. There was a Greek term called karkinos, and that was Greek for crab. So that was the first description of breast cancer. And the reason they call it a crab is they thought the crab had tentacles. And cancer really is, even today, and when we operate on it, it's like tentacles. It has growths that come out from it and grab on the tissue and increase vascular. So even way back with Hippocrates, he was the first sort of to describe cancer and breast cancer. And then from there was kind of a big gap until a little before Abraham Lincoln's time, 1757. There was a Frenchman, Ledron, and he was the first one to say, well, breast cancer, the really only cure is surgical. And back then, they really didn't have the instrumentation or the medications or anesthesia to do that, but they were able to do grossly some surgical removals and found out really that was the only way to cure a woman from breast cancer back. And that's a little before Lincoln's time, 1757. Then came the big surgical name of the United States, and that was Halsted, and that's in New York City. And he was the first one to say, okay, I agree with this, and now we're going to take off the entire breast. We're going to call it a radical mastectomy, so removal of the whole breast. And that was really the norm for 100 years, if you believe it or not, really few advances. And the reason we call it radical is he not only took the breast off, but he took part of the pectoralis muscle and everything else. And it was very deforming, but since at the time that's all they had, it did provide some cures in breast cancer. So that brought us really to the Civil War time when they had the ability to make better instrumentations, mold metals. There were better surgical gear. Anesthesia started coming around.
I was going to ask you, at what point in this process there was any pain control besides bite down on this?
Right. Halsted was the first, but it was ether, and it was very, very crude. So, so that's when things started getting a little more improved techniques for the women. But there was a physician, his name was Beetson, and at that time, he noticed that if you removed the ovaries, the breast cancer would get smaller. So this was the first time, just a little after Lincoln's time, that there was a correlation between breast cancer and hormones. And as we talk today and get into this more, you'll realize that hormones, estrogen, progesterone, have huge influences on breast cancer itself. So by removing the ovaries, they saw a decrease in the size of the breast cancer, and that was the first time that it was ever noted that there was a correlation. Then in 1952, there was a Dr. Higgins who started removing the adrenal gland. And if those of you out there who don't know that, the adrenal gland also makes estrogen. And so they saw a decrease in the size of breast cancer with removal of adrenals. But removal of adrenal gland takes away all the other very essential hormones you have in your body, cortisol and everything else. And that was disastrous for your body, but it did shrink your breast cancer. So I'm trying to give you this link of how things are going in time. And up until 1976, which isn't really that long ago, Dr. Fisher was the first to say, hey, let's take a step back. Let's not do the Halsted radical mastectomy. Let's do a modified where we don't take as much tissue. And then they found out that the survival rates were just as good. So that was the first time in history that we took a step back, doing less aggressive treatment for breast cancer, and the survival rate was just as good. Things stayed about the same until the 1990s, where the hugest advancements in breast cancer occurred, and that's when we started doing research on DNA and found out that there were genes that were correlated with breast cancer. And many of you have heard of these BRCA1, BRCA2, and ATM genes. And to make a long story short, what these are, they're suppression genes. And what that means is in our body, we have suppression genes that make molecules that fix your cells. Your cells are always breaking down, but they go and try to repair them. And it was found out that if you have a problem with these repair genes, then, and in these particular ones on your DNA, long DNA sample, that you would have an increased chance of breast cancer. And at the end of today's talk, I'm going to give you the real up-to-date literature that I know about DNA and genes, but we'll get to that later. But that brings us to most of our breast history right now. So we talked a little about the history. Let's just get into the data of breast cancer. Today, 1 in 8 women have breast cancer, which is horrible. That's a lot. I guess when I was a little kid, it was about 1 in 12, but we started investigating. More women started having screening, and we caught more of it. So
and
that
the government didn't spend near as much money on this for a long time. Am I right about
Correct.
that? There was like a political controversy
Sure,
over how
sure.
much.
And
That's what
because they didn't want to spend the money on screening.
CDC or whoever does all that.
But it truly right now is 1 in 8, and that's amazing. It's the number one killer of women for cancer, and number 2 for death total. But for cancer, it's the number one killer for women. They always give all these big numbers that really don't make sense, but I kind of look at it. I try to break it down. If you're talking about the state of Indiana, you're talking about 5,000 women. 5,000 in the state of Indiana, roughly per year, is going to have breast cancer. And if you think of every little town, that's almost like 1 in every town. So that's a lot of women. For men, it's more rare. It's about 100 times less common. But men, when they have breast cancer, they don't realize they have breast cancer, so it usually is more advanced. So it's a higher killer for men because they let it go longer.
Actually caught later in the process.
Yes, sir. But the disease itself actually behaves the same if it was caught at the same stage. And in the world, the breast cancer is number one cancer for women too. So it's not just the United States. So we can talk about what's some of the things that make women at higher risk and not. And some of those is early menses, late menopause, women who have children who are older than 40 years old, or those women who don't have any children at all. I want to knock off some myths about things that people say cause breast cancer but don't. Contact, if you are in contact with someone with breast cancer, there's no increased chance for you to get breast cancer. If you have implants, there's no increased chance of breast cancer. If you go in for yearly mammograms and that radiation from the mammograms, there's no increase in breast cancer from that. So there's myths out there. There's a mild association. It's not direct. It's very mild that you have a mild increased chance of breast cancer with poor diet, poor activity, obesity, drinking, having some radiation, or the use of oral contraceptives. It's not a direct link. There's a mild association. So those are not good for you either. Generally, going back to the pathophysiology of breast cancer, it's a damage in the DNA, and the DNA is mutated, and the mutation causes cells to replicate and replicate and replicate. And the thing to learn today is that if you have one little cell that is the first cell that mutates, it takes a long time to get multiple divisions of cancer to get to 2 centimeters. But from 2 centimeters to get larger and spread throughout the body doesn't take too long.
Right.
And that's the thing, why I'm here today talking about this. It's very important to go in for your mammograms, do your monthly self-examinations in the shower. It's so important to catch it early, because when it gets so large, I'm making a rough estimate of what size is important, what's not, but generally 2 centimeters, you want to catch it before then. And all these things are really important for the women out there for screening for breast cancer. So the next natural question will, what does the organization say that's needed for screening for breast cancer? There's 7 organizations, and not all of them agree, but I'm making a basic statement in generalization of all 7 groups, is that you should have a mammogram at age 50, and you should have it every other year from there. You should start having your self-breast exams in your 30s, and you should see your physician regularly for them to do an exam too, because sometimes yourself, you're not the best at examining your own breasts and finding those lumps. When you have a family history of breast cancer, then it's even more important for screening, because you are at a higher risk. And then the question is, well, what is that higher risk? And going back to those BRCA1, BRCA2 genes, those who have those overall have a 10% or higher chance than the regular population. And if you have a family history, it can be up to 65%, depending on which gene. So those are good markers, but the catch is it's not really a good marker for the general population. It's a good marker if you have a family history. So in summary, if you have a family history, direct sister, mother with breast cancer, then genetic testing is probably a good idea. But for the general woman on the street with no history, it's not the best test. Moving on, the diagnosis of breast cancer, once a woman feels a lump or there's an abnormal mammogram, there are many options. And those options include an open biopsy, a fine needle biopsy, a core needle biopsy, and ultrasound localization, needle localization. So there are many different ways, including some of the higher technology ones, which are called stereotactic. And those are where they actually use mammography and a machine at the same time, and they go in with the needle under mammography to remove the small lesion. So there are many different ways to make the diagnosis of breast cancer once you feel a lump. And that's the time to see your surgeon for those options, and they'll give you all the options that are best for you. Each woman, each female is an individual patient, and not one type of procedure is right for everybody. So, but we know all the different types are out there, and Woodlawn Hospital, which is a great hospital, has many of those options that we can offer to you.
Excellent.
Next, if you had the biopsy and if it was to be cancer, which would be horrible news, But there are many treatments. And if you catch your breast cancer early, there's 100% survival. Even if you catch it less than 2 centimeters, there's greater than 95% survival. So the reason I'm sitting here talking about this once again is to make sure that you do your screening, do your monthly self-exams, and try to catch this early, because the survival is greater than 95% to 100% if you catch it early. And some of the treatments, once there is a diagnosis of breast cancer, includes, of course, mastectomy, and we call it modified radical mastectomy. But more common is a lumpectomy, where we just take the tumor out with a little margin. But once you sign up for lumpectomy, then you must have radiation treatment with it. So that's the catch. It's a lumpectomy with radiation, or you could have the full breast removed, a modified radical mastectomy without radiation. If the tumor is spread, and it's very complicated, but I'm being vague, but if the tumor has spread, then you would need more, including radiation, chemo, even if you had a mastectomy. So there are many different types of operations, not only remove the tumor, but even on breast conservation. So today we can remove tumors and put implants in on the same day, and there are many options. It can be somewhat complicated, but you can see your local surgeon, come to Woodlawn Hospital. Your physicians or surgeons here can give you all those options, and we can talk to you.
I wanted to ask you before we wrap this up for this week, and of course we got another one coming up in a couple of weeks, and it'll still be Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so we can continue. But something I've always wondered, and you don't see it discussed a lot on television or any place else, what actually happens to a cell when it becomes cancerous? If I have a cancerous cell in my lung, for example, will that cell no longer absorb oxygen and pass it along the blood the way it used to? Or is the problem we just have so many of them? Or what is actually, I know the cells are replicating and they're out of control, but what are they replicating into? Are they functioning cells, or just something that's sitting there taking up nutrients?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously, as you know, it's being investigated right now, even today. But to answer that it is exactly the same cell. It's a mutated cell. And the only thing is that there are certain genes that tell it to only replicate once or replicate over and over, and those genes are turned on. So it is a high functioning turnover cell that has, and when you do something too fast, it becomes irregular. In other words, a car and an auto, they're making autos. If you make those autos too fast down the the line, they're not going to be perfect. So there are problems with it. It's abnormal, but it is that tissue of where it's replicating that cancer. It is that type of cell. It does take oxygen, and it takes more blood supply because it's revved up. And
sooner or later, the number of dysfunctional cells will override the functional ones. And
take over.
And by the time it starts hurting, it's usually too big.
Yes.
Past the point where you should have caught it.
Correct.
Okay, very good. Again, Doc Talk with Dr. Keith Thomae. And he is OBGYN at Woodlawn Hospital.
General surgery.
General surgery, I'm sorry. He's got OBGYN. I see. Yes. English language, Baron. General surgeon, Dr. Seward's the OBGYN. So as a general surgeon, I assume you don't just do cancer surgeries, but
all types of surgery.
By appendix or what have you.
You got it. Gallbladder, appendix, anything in the abdomen, head, neck.
In the few minutes we have left, what's the general knowledge now about how long we have? Because we've seen them clone cells, we've seen them clone sheep. How long is it going to be before we can replicate organs on a level? Some of the organs aren't that complicated, obviously, but we're still wondering what all's in the brain. But I mean, I have seen reports that we can start to grow heart tissue and lung tissue, and I'm wondering how long if there's any thought.
We're there. We're actually there. Oh, yeah. It's out there.
Some of my lung out and get it to replace or whatever?
Yeah, that's being done right now.
Wow.
Not for not at the university hospitals, not where you can walk in and do it,
Right.
but research-wise, yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
I thought
And they're
that I
doing
read that.
with animals and everything. It's pretty impressive.
I read an article where they've been able to take away everything but the connective tissue in the heart and regrow the muscle. And
Correct.
if they can get to that point, then,
Absolutely. There's going to medicine and that whole field within 10 years will be very
we're
impressive.
going to see some pretty amazing things.
And then, as you can guess, it'll be a financial thing.
Well, yeah, that's
Like
always the
always.
big thing, but they always figure that out eventually.
Right.
Or sometimes they do. Again, Dr. Keith Thomae, we thank you very kindly for your time. We'll be talking to you again
You're welcome.
here in 2 weeks, yes? Or Dr. Seward, anyway.
Dr. Stewart will be here. I'll be here 1 month from now.
All righty then.
And I'd like to close by making sure I can alert all the women out there to get their screening mammograms, do their self-examinations.
Yes, please. We're not through with you yet, so take the steps to make sure you hang around.
Great. Come to Woodlawn Hospital and we'll treat you well. All
How
right.
could we, do you have a phone number we can get a hold of your office, or at least your,
Just call the hospital.
just call
and
the hospital, and
they'll
is
get right to
2020? 223, I think so. Anyway, look it up in your phone book. Just give Woodlawn Hospital a call. Thanks, Doc. We
All right.
appreciate it very much.
Have a great day.